The boardroom was a gleaming expanse of glass and steel, a fortress of power in the heart of the city. The morning sun slanted through the high, floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the sharp suits and even sharper expressions of the people inside. Jonathan Briggs, the CEO of Westfield Enterprises, leaned back in his chair, eyes glinting with satisfaction. His voice, smooth and commanding, filled the room as he addressed the board. "Gentlemen, I've just been informed that our new cost-cutting initiative is projected to save the company millions. But, of course, there will be sacrifices." He let out a short, mirthless laugh, eyes flicking toward the hallway. "Let's just hope those who don't matter don't see it coming." The room erupted in a chorus of low chuckles, the sound like a swarm of wasps. Outside, Mrs. Gloria James's footsteps echoed down the hallway, the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of her cleaning cart, a stark contrast to the laughter behind the door. Dressed in a plain blue uniform, she moved with the grace of someone who knew this building better than most. Every hallway, every door, every secret. But today, her eyes were sharp, her movements deliberate. She paused in front of the boardroom door, listening. "Look at her," Briggs's voice cut through the air. "Does she think she's above us? Cleaning up after people who matter." The words bit, the echo of his scorn snaking out to where she stood. The laughter that followed was like a slap. Mrs. James's face remained impassive. She'd heard worse. But beneath her calm exterior, something burned. A spark, long buried, reignited. They had no idea who she was or what she carried. As the laughter died down, she pushed forward, past the door, through the labyrinth of silence, into the unknown. This was her moment, and it would change everything. The building was dim and nearly silent that evening. The hum of fluorescent lights cast a cold, sterile glow down the long hallways. Mrs. Gloria James moved with practiced precision. Her hands deftly pushed the cleaning cart, her eyes scanning the polished floors as they reflected the harsh light. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and old wood, an aroma she had come to associate with late-night shifts and secrets whispered through thin walls. She reached the boardroom, the colossal double doors standing imposingly in front of her. The voices inside carried a subtle vibration, a muffled thrum that she could just make out. Mrs. James paused, her gloved hand on the handle. A faint sense of dread crept up her spine as she listened. "Tomorrow, I make the cuts that'll save the company millions." Jonathan Briggs's voice boomed, smooth and confident. The sound sliced through the air, filled with a satisfaction so dark it seemed to crackle. "Those who don't matter will never see it coming." The echo of his words reverberated in her chest, as if he had struck her with an unseen hand. Mrs. James's hands trembled, the bright orange of the cleaning cloth she held now a blur in her grip. The icy realization that the lives of her colleagues, her friends, were about to be torn apart sent a shockwave through her. But deeper still was the fury that ignited within her, fierce, wild, and unrelenting. "How dare he?" she whispered, the words slipping from her lips before she even knew they were there. The voice of the man who had laughed at her, mocked her, was the same one planning to take so much more than just jobs. It was as if every slight she had endured throughout her time at Westfield Enterprises had built up to this moment. And now, it demanded action. Mrs. James took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling with an almost imperceptible shudder. She knew the power of secrets, how they could destroy or build, heal or wound. But now, the secret she carried was one that would bring Jonathan Briggs to his knees. "Enough," she muttered, turning and glancing down the hallway. The rows of office doors, their polished surfaces reflecting the dim light, felt like sentinels. They were silent, watching, waiting for whatever would come next. Mrs. James's mind was a storm, lightning and wind swirling with thoughts she had suppressed for years. It was time to reclaim that power. The next morning, the building was bustling with energy, the pulse of urgency in the air. The boardroom was already full. Executives sat with tense postures, shuffling papers, exchanging glances sharp with anticipation. Briggs stood at the head of the table, his dark eyes scanning the room like a hawk. The scent of expensive cologne mixed with the faint aroma of fresh coffee. a reminder that this was still a place where luxury met ruthlessness. "Gentlemen," Briggs began, raising his voice to command attention, his tone crisp, edged with the confidence of a man who believed his empire was untouchable. "This is the moment we've all been waiting for. The cuts are necessary, and they're going to be swift." The murmurs of approval shifted into a strained silence. A new presence entered the room. The doors swung open with an unexpected force. Mrs. Gloria James stepped in, no longer clad in the familiar blue uniform. She wore a tailored black suit that fit her with an elegance that left the room breathless. A few executives exchanged looks, the blood draining from their faces as they recognized her. "Mr. Briggs," she said, her voice cutting through the stunned silence like a blade. It was steady, unwavering, and fierce. The way she stood, straight-backed and unyielding, spoke of a resolve they had never seen before. Briggs's smirk faltered for the briefest moment. He cleared his throat, a subtle gesture that restored his composure. "Mrs. James," he said, his voice low, tinged with disbelief. "What are you doing here?" "I'm here," she said, her eyes locking onto his, "to make sure you don't destroy any more lives for profit." A wave of confusion swept through the room, followed by a nervous chuckle from one of the senior managers. "What's the cleaning lady going to do?" he muttered, earning a few uneasy laughs from the others. Briggs glared at the man, and the room grew quiet again. "Mrs. James, you're in over your head," Briggs spat, his voice turning cold and sharp. "You have no power here, no influence. You're just the woman who scrubs our floors." She didn't flinch. She opened the folder she carried and laid it on the table. The thud reverberated through the room. The air seemed to grow thicker. The executives leaned forward, their expressions shifting from amusement to unease. "This," she said, her voice even, "is what will stop you." Briggs's eyes narrowed as he glanced at the contents. It was just the beginning. The tide had turned, but no one knew it yet, least of all him. Mrs. James's eyes met Briggs's with an intensity that seemed to cut through the room's chilled air. The silence was deafening, broken only by the subtle creak of the wooden floor as the executives shifted in their seats. "What's in the folder?" one of the junior board members whispered, barely audible. Briggs scoffed, a thin, derisive smile playing on his lips. He glanced at the folder as if it were a mere annoyance. "I'm waiting for an explanation," he sneered, turning his attention back to Mrs. James. The room settled into a tense, almost electric stillness as the executives leaned forward, curiosity battling the fear that gnawed at them. Mrs. James took a measured step forward, her fingers brushing the top of the folder as if to anchor herself to the moment. "I'm not here to play games, Mr. Briggs," she said, her voice now a low, controlled rasp. "This is the beginning of the end for you." Briggs's eyes flashed with fury. He rose slowly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. The room, already tight with tension, felt even more suffocating now. He took a step toward her, and his voice dropped, dark and threatening. "You're making a grave mistake, Mrs. James. You have no idea who you're dealing with." She didn't flinch. She raised her chin, meeting his glare with unwavering resolve. "I know exactly who you are, and I know what you've done." The murmurs among the board members grew, a mix of shock and disbelief. Some faces turned pale, others twitched with barely concealed fear. But a spark of doubt also began to flicker in the room's atmosphere. The power, once so palpable and taken for granted, started to feel more fragile. Briggs laughed, a sound that was meant to intimidate, but only underscored his desperation. "You think you can bring down an empire with a folder and empty threats?" He gestured dismissively, but his hands trembled imperceptibly. Mrs. James's fingers tightened around the edge of the folder. She knew the weight of the evidence it held: bank statements, confidential emails, recordings of board meetings where decisions were made without conscience, sealed with the cost of human lives. And she knew that Briggs's arrogance had blinded him to the fact that he'd underestimated her. "Let's find out," she said quietly, as the silence stretched tighter, daring him to challenge her. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the storm to break. Briggs's smirk faltered, just for a second, but it was enough. He glanced at the folder, then at Mrs. James, and for the first time, doubt shadowed his sharp features. "You're making a mistake," he repeated, but the edge in his voice was no longer assured. Mrs. James opened the folder, the sound of paper rustling, slicing through the silence. "This isn't a mistake," she said, placing the first document before him. It was a financial summary showing millions transferred to offshore accounts, disguised as operational expenses. Briggs's jaw clenched as he scanned the document. The initial shock in his eyes was soon replaced by a quick, harsh grin. "You think this is enough to stop me? You're playing a dangerous game." He glanced at the room, eyes shifting from one board member to another, gauging their reactions. "You're right," Mrs. James said, leaning forward. "But it's a game you're going to lose." She pushed the folder across the table, where it landed with a finality that echoed through the room. The youngest board member, a nervous-looking man named Adam, finally spoke up, his voice thin but certain. "Mr. Briggs, I've seen some of this before. This can't be true, can it?" He turned to look at the others, seeking confirmation or solidarity. Briggs's smile was gone, replaced by an expression of genuine unease. The room's murmur grew louder, the once unyielding atmosphere shifting as whispers of doubt filled the space. He had always been in control, but now, for the first time, he realized that his fortress was not as impenetrable as he thought. "Adam, sit down," Briggs commanded, his voice wavering for the first time. But Adam stood firm, his gaze locked on the documents in front of him. "Mr. Briggs, the evidence is here. The truth is here," Adam said, his voice gaining strength. "If we ignore this, we become complicit." A ripple of agreement swept across the room, soft at first, but growing louder as others glanced at each other, some looking ashamed, others with eyes wide with realization. Briggs's face contorted with anger, but it was a new kind of anger, the kind that burned with the heat of desperation. "You'll regret this," he said, but there was no longer any conviction behind it. Mrs. James straightened her shoulders, her voice calm as she said, "No, Mr. Briggs, it's you who will regret underestimating me." And as she walked out of the boardroom, leaving the room in stunned silence, the storm had begun. The first cracks in an empire that would soon be brought to its knees. The night air was electric, charged with anticipation. Mrs. Gloria James stood on the makeshift stage, in the center of the bustling city square. The crowd had gathered in droves, drawn by rumors of a story that would shake the very foundation of power. As the first notes of her voice cut through the night, a hush settled, drawing the attention of even the most skeptical bystanders. "My name is Gloria James," she began, her voice strong and unwavering, each syllable precise. The crowd leaned forward, straining to catch every word. "And for years, I hid a truth that has been buried by those who would rather see me silenced." A wave of gasps swept through the audience. Some faces were painted with confusion, others with shock. The woman who had spent years in the shadows of their city was more than just the cleaning lady they had dismissed. Mrs. James raised her hand, palm out, to keep them from interrupting. "Before I was forced to take this job, before they thought I was just a voice in the background, I was an executive." The whispers in the crowd grew louder. Murmurs of disbelief punctuated by "no way" and "it can't be." But Mrs. James pressed on. Her eyes scanned the sea of faces, each one drawn deeper into the story. "I once held the power to make decisions, to shape destinies, but my voice was stifled, and my career crushed by those who didn't want someone like me to lead." Jonathan Briggs, the very man who thought he could destroy others without consequence, was the architect of that downfall. A few feet away, in a dark corner of the square, Jonathan Briggs stood, his face an unreadable mask, his mouth set in a thin line, eyes locked on Mrs. James. She seemed to tower over him, despite the distance. His pulse quickened. He recognized the gravity of the moment. This was not just a public revelation. It was the first strike in a battle he hadn't seen coming. The crowd continued to listen, each word peeling away the layers of lies that had shielded Briggs's actions for so long. Mrs. James spoke of her dismissal, of how she had been framed, made to look incompetent in the eyes of the board. "They fed me scraps of falsehoods. and left me to clean up the messes of their mistakes, she said. Her voice caught, only briefly. But today, I reclaim my voice, and the truth will no longer be buried. A man in the crowd, wearing a faded suit and holding a weathered briefcase, stepped forward. I've worked in that building for over a decade, he said, his voice raw with emotion. We all knew there was something more, something hidden behind the corporate smiles and boardroom handshakes. But hearing you, seeing you, tells us it's real. A surge of agreement followed. The crowd's murmur turned into unified shouts. The faces of the executives peering from their high-rise offices, far above the growing sea of people, were no longer filled with smug confidence. Fear crept in, writhing in the shadows of their expressions. The voices of the people were not just raised in support of Mrs. James, but against the system that had long kept them powerless. She knew it. She saw it reflected in their eyes. The realization that their lives had been manipulated, their voices ignored, and their hardships exploited for the gains of a few. This is not just my fight, Mrs. James continued. This is yours too. We have all been silenced, but we're done being silent. The crowd erupted. Chants broke out, echoing through the streets. A roar of defiance that resonated for miles. The word justice became their rallying cry. Briggs's face was pallid, a deep line carved between his brows. He clenched his fists at his sides, willing the room to return to the suffocating silence that had once made him feel invincible. He had underestimated Mrs. James. Now, with the truth gaining momentum, his empire stood on the brink of collapse. At that moment, a young woman in the crowd, clutching her phone, yelled out, "Tell us more, Gloria." The chant rippled through the square, urging Mrs. James to go on. And she did. She recounted meetings she'd secretly recorded, emails that laid bare the ruthless strategies of Briggs's regime. Each revelation peeled back another layer of the facade, exposing the rot beneath. This company's prosperity has come at the cost of countless lives, she said, her voice now a crescendo. People lost their jobs, their homes, and their dignity, so that Jonathan Briggs could add another zero to his bank account. But today, the world will know he is not invincible. Today, justice is no longer a dream. It's here. The roar from the crowd surged again. Louder, stronger. It was no longer just Mrs. James speaking. It was the voice of the oppressed, the weary, and the brave. The executives who had once laughed and dismissed her now shifted uncomfortably. They realized they could not turn away from this reckoning. Mrs. James took a deep breath, letting the wave of emotion wash over her, steadying herself. The truth, once buried beneath layers of deception and power, was now out. Nothing would ever be the same again. The conference hall was packed to capacity, a sea of journalists and influential figures pressing in from all sides. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind of electricity that hinted at an impending storm. Jonathan Briggs stepped up to the podium with his signature air of confidence. His eyes scanned the room, his smile tight. He raised a hand to silence the murmuring crowd. His gaze swept over the reporters, board members, and executives who stood in the back. This was his arena, his domain, where he ruled with an iron fist. "Thank you all for joining me today," Briggs began, his voice smooth and unflinching. "I am here to address the recent allegations that have caused unnecessary panic and disorder." His voice was clipped, precise, but carried an undertone of desperation, a tremor that was barely perceptible. A few skeptical eyes met his, and then there was the sound of the main entrance doors creaking open. A murmur swept through the room as Mrs. Gloria James walked in, her presence commanding, her tailored suit impeccable. Gone was the meek cleaning lady, the invisible worker in the corner of the building. Before the entire room, she was reborn as a formidable force. Her eyes met Briggs, unwavering and fierce. "I am not who you think I am, Mr. Briggs," Mrs. James said, stepping forward to the microphone. Her voice carried a weight that seemed to push back against the crowd's unease. "I'm the reckoning you never prepared for." Gasps rippled through the room, the sound sharp and jagged, slicing through the suffocating tension. Briggs' smile faltered, just for a fraction of a second before he recovered. His eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. "Mrs. James," he said, the mockery lacing his words as he shifted his stance. "I think it's time you leave. You have no place here." But Mrs. James didn't flinch. Instead, she opened the folder in her hands, letting the contents spill out with a rustle. Documents, financial statements, and photos, all meticulously organized, spread across the table. The murmuring grew louder, more urgent. Briggs' inner circle shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting between the evidence and their leader. "Do you remember this?" Mrs. James asked, her voice now steely with authority. She picked up one of the bank records and held it up. The room fell into an almost tangible silence as the document registered with those who had seen it before. A transfer made just weeks before, money siphoned from a charity fund to an untraceable account. It was damning, and it was only the beginning. "I know you've been moving assets, hiding your tracks, but it's all here," she continued, flipping through the folder and producing an audio recording. "Here's a meeting you had with your senior advisors, discussing the layoffs. You promised them that the losses would be covered by funds you'd siphoned from employee pensions." The audio crackled to life, Briggs' voice echoing through the speakers. "The numbers need to match the projections. We're cutting overheads, and that means taking the money where it's safe. No one will question it." The room was no longer silent. It was in chaos. Reporters shouted questions, some even standing to push their way forward, their cameras flashing, trying to capture the scene. Executives who had once looked down at Mrs. James now stood frozen, their faces pale and fearful. The man who had mocked her most vocally, Senior Vice President Carl Renner, suddenly dropped his head, unable to meet her gaze. A voice broke through the din, trembling but resolute. It was Marcus Taylor, one of Briggs' former allies. He stood up from his seat at the back of the room, the sweat on his brow catching the harsh lights. "She's telling the truth," Marcus said, his voice cracking under the weight of his admission. A ripple of shock spread through the crowd, and Briggs's face darkened, eyes narrowing with an intensity that promised retribution. "You're a fool, Marcus," Briggs spat, stepping forward as if to intimidate his former colleague. "You know what this means for you." "It means I'm ready to do what's right," Marcus retorted, the quiver in his voice betraying the fear that twisted in his chest. Mrs. James turned back to the room, her eyes scanning the sea of faces now illuminated by the glaring floodlights. "This is only the beginning," she said, her voice ringing clear. "I have the proof, but it's not just about me. This is about every person who's been exploited, discarded, and pushed aside for profit. It's about reclaiming power." The gasps turned into shouts, the shouts into chants. The executives, once so secure, looked as if they were standing on the edge of a cliff, ready to fall. Briggs' smugness shattered, replaced by a fury that could no longer be masked. "We won't let this stand," Briggs snarled, his voice low, as if speaking only to himself. But the crowd had already begun to shift, a force in motion that would not be stopped. The tide had changed. Mrs. James stood at the epicenter, unyielding and defiant. And for the first time, Briggs felt the cold fingers of fear wrap around his heart. The room buzzed with the electric thrill of justice finally served. News crews from every major network swarmed the boardroom, their cameras flashing like fireflies. Mrs. James stood by the large window, watching the first rays of dawn cut through the city skyline. A soft knock on the door broke her concentration. Turning, she saw Ava, a young intern with wide, earnest eyes, and a nervous smile. "Mrs. James?" Ava said, holding a sheaf of papers tightly to her chest. "The board wants to see you. They're ready to make their announcement." Mrs. James nodded, smoothing down her tailored suit, and trying to steady the storm of emotions swirling within her. The battle was won, but the war was far from over. This was the moment when the company's future would be decided, and so much more. As she walked down the hall, whispers trailed behind her, like the rustle of leaves. The once dismissive glances and scoffs were replaced with a mix of awe and apprehension. The power dynamics that had once left her invisible had shifted in the blink of an eye. She stepped into the boardroom, where the same faces that had once laughed at her now sat in uneasy silence. "Mrs. James," the chairman said, clearing his throat and glancing at the others, "we're here to discuss the company's future and the steps we must take to restore our integrity." Mrs. James's eyes swept over the room, pausing on Mr. Briggs, whose once commanding presence had been reduced to a shadow of its former self. He sat hunched, handcuffs glinting in the harsh fluorescent light, his arrogance buried beneath a mask of defeat. "I've spent years watching you all exploit people, hide behind wealth, and turn a blind eye to justice," she said, her voice cool but steady. "This company can be more. It must be more. It's time for a new direction." Murmurs rippled through the board. The room held its breath as the chairman nodded. "We agree. We need you to lead us through this." A surge of emotion gripped Mrs. James, but she took a deep breath, steadying herself. This was what she had fought for, a chance to create change that would echo far beyond the polished walls of corporate greed. "Then let's begin," she said, stepping forward. Over the following weeks, Mrs. James worked tirelessly, dismantling the corrupted systems and replacing them with fairer, more ethical practices. She was more than an executive. She was the face of a revolution, a woman whose story inspired those who had been silenced for far too long. Her office, once a place of frustration and hidden shame, became a beacon of hope. In the corridors, whispers about her ascension grew louder. Employees who had once avoided her now stopped to offer quiet words of encouragement. Ava, the intern, became her trusted assistant, eager to help shape the new future. One afternoon, as she sorted through a stack of reports, Mrs. James found a handwritten note on her desk. It read, "Thank you for showing us that courage can come from the most unexpected places." She smiled, her heart swelling with pride and relief. The fight had changed her, made her tougher and wiser, but it had also given her a new mission: to use her position to create opportunities, to build a foundation where power was shared, not hoarded. That evening, she stood by the window once more. The city lights stretched out before her, reflecting the bruised and vivid hues of the sunset. She could almost hear the voices of those who had come before her, those who had fought battles that seemed impossible to win. They were part of her now, woven into the fabric of her resilience. A soft knock came at the door, and Ava peeked in, holding a cup of tea. "It's time," Ava said, her eyes sparkling with a mix of nerves and excitement. Mrs. James nodded. She walked to the door, her heart steady and her spirit fierce. This was more than just a victory. This was a moment that would carry its lessons far beyond the halls of the boardroom. It was proof that no matter how deep the injustice or how high the walls, true strength could break through, even when the world least expected it. As she stepped out into the hallway, the walls seemed to whisper their approval. Outside, the city thrummed with life, its pulse beating in time with her own. And Mrs. Gloria James, once unseen, now stood at the center of change, a testament to the power of resilience, the strength of justice, and the unyielding spirit of the human heart.